April 1945. The end of the war in Europe is in sight, but in northern Italy, the fighting is a frozen, muddy hell. This is the Gothic line, a 200-mile-long defensive wall of German concrete, machine gun nests, and artillery built into the very bones of the Apennine Mountains. For 6 months, this line has held. For 6 months, Allied forces have thrown themselves against it, only to be broken. The terrain is the enemy's greatest ally. The roads are nothing but narrow mule tracks winding through deep, wet mud. And trapped in this stalemate is the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, the FEB, 25,000 men from a tropical country, fighting in a brutal European winter they had never trained for. The smoking cobras, a name born from a joke that it was more likely for a snake to smoke than for Brazil to enter the war. Now the snake was here, and it was freezing. The Brazilians were assigned some of the hardest targets on the line Monte Castello. La Ferran Castelnuovo, their enemy wasn't just the terrain. It was the elite 148th Infantry Division and hardened Italian Alpini troops. But the true king of this battlefield was a machine, the MG-42. The Germans nicknamed it Hitler's buzzsaw. The Brazilians had their own name for it, Lordinha, a strange, almost affectionate name for a weapon that fired 20 rounds per second. De calle de Lordinha, because its tearing sound was as fast and non-stop as the chatter of a famous gossip columnist in Rio de Janeiro. But Lordinha was no joke. It pinned down entire platoons. In the mountains, the battlefield was inverted. The Germans held the high ground. Always, they could see every Brazilian advance. The moment an FEB platoon left its foxholes, the air would be torn apart by that sound. Men would dive into mud, into shell craters, unable to move, unable to retreat. This was the deadly equation of the Gothic line. The Brazilians were fighting in a bowl, and the Germans were shooting down at them. The textbook solution was simple. Call in the mortar. A mortar is an infantryman's personal artillery. It fires a heavy shell in a high, arcing trajectory, allowing it to drop perfectly into an enemy trench or machine gun nest that a rifle cannot reach. The Brazilians were equipped with the standard American M181mm mortars, a reliable, powerful weapon. It was the perfect tool to silence Lordinha. But on the Gothic line, standard doctrine was failing. The M1 mortar weighed 136 pounds. That's 62 kilograms. It had to be broken down into 3 heavy pieces: the barrel, the bipod, and the base plate. To set it up, the crew had to find flat, stable ground luxury that didn't exist on a 45-degree, mud-slicked mountain slope. The entire process was dangerously slow. First, a forward observer had to spot the machine gun nest. Then, he had to radio the coordinates to the mortar crew, who were positioned hundreds of meters back, hidden behind a ridge. Then, the 3-man mortar team would have to haul their 136 pounds of equipment up the treacherous, exposed trail. Once they found a least worst spot, they had to dig in. The base plate had to be perfectly level, otherwise the shot would fly wide. They had to assemble the barrel, mount the bipod, adjust the sight, and calculate the angle. This entire process took minutes, sometimes 10, sometimes 20, all while the forward observer was hiding in a ditch, whispering into his radio, and the infantry platoon was being systematically torn apart. The MG-42 could kill a man in less than a second. The Brazilian mortar response took 20 minutes. This was the time gap. This was the deadly equation of the app. For every 20 minutes, the mortar crew struggled with their equipment. The German Lordinha could fire over 24,000 rounds. The Brazilians were losing, not because they lacked courage, but because their doctrine was too slow. Their solution was as heavy and as stuck as the mud they were dying in. The problem wasn't firepower. The M1 mortar had plenty of that. The problem was speed. The Brazilians needed a way to get their heavy firepower from point A to point B. Set it up, fire, and get out, all before the enemy artillery could zero in on their position. They needed their mortars to be as fast as a rifle. But how? How do you make 136 pounds of heavy steel mobile? This is where the heroius cacido of our story emerges. He isn't a general. He isn't a famous officer. He is likely a sergeant, or perhaps a sabot, a corporal, a man whose name is lost to history, but whose idea survives. He was probably not a career soldier. He was a Brazilian, a man from São Paulo or Minas Gerais, a man who, in civilian life, was probably a mechanic, or a farmer, or a factory worker. He was, in short, a man trained in the art of improvisation, the Jetinho. He looked at the problem not through the lens of military doctrine, but through the lens of practical real-world problem-solving. He saw two pieces of equipment. In one hand, he had the M1 mortar, heavy, slow, powerful, and useless. In the other hand, he had the Willys Jeep. The Jeep was the exact opposite of the mortar. It was light, fast, agile, and loved the mud. It was the symbol of Allied mobility. It could climb hills, cross streams, and dart through forests. But according to Doctrine, it was just a taxi. It carried ammunition, it carried generals, it carried wounded soldiers. It was a workhorse, not a warhorse. The sergeant looked at the 136-pound mortars, designed to be fired only from the stable earth. He looked at the 2,400-pound Jeep, a thin-skinned vehicle never meant for combat. And he had an idea that was brilliant, an idea that was stupid, an idea that broke every rule in the American field manual. What if the mortars didn't have to be carried? What if the Jeep could do more than just transport the weapon? What if the Jeep became the weapon? The idea was insane on its face. An 81mm mortar is a violent, explosive weapon. When it fires, it generates thousands of pounds of recoil force. That force is designed to be absorbed by the ground. The heavy steel baseplate, weighing over 40 pounds, exists for one reason: to slam that recoil deep into the dirt. If it isn't stable, the mortar tube will jump, destroying any hope of accuracy and potentially killing the crew. The Willys Jeep, on the other hand, was a simple metal box on 4 rubber tires. It was designed to be light, not stable. Firing an 81mm mortar from the back of a Jeep was like trying to fire a cannon from a canoe. The recoil force wouldn't just spoil the aim, it would almost certainly shatter the Jeep's suspension, buckle its frame, or, at worst, flip the entire vehicle over. The American Field Manual, FMB 23-90, was explicitly clear. The mortar must be emplaced on solid ground. Firing it from a vehicle was not just unauthorized. It was suicidal. But this Brazilian sergeant, this nameless mechanic or farmer, wasn't reading the field manual. He was solving a problem. He knew the doctrine, he knew the rules, and he knew they were getting his friends killed. His logic was simple. The problem is speed. The Jeep is speed. Therefore, the Jeep is the solution. The question wasn't, is this allowed? The question was, how do we make it work? This was the Jetinho in action, a philosophy of creative circumvention. It wasn't about breaking rules for the sake of it. It was about bending reality to fit the need. So the Gambiarra, the hack, began. He gathered his crew. They probably liberated a Jeep from the motor pool, telling the commanding officer it was for an ammunition run. They got their M1 mortar, and they got to work. They couldn't just throw the mortar in the back. They needed to solve the problem of recoil. The 40-pound baseplate was the key. It was designed to transfer force to the ground. But what if the ground wasn't the earth? What if the ground was the chassis of the Jeep itself? They first had to rip out the Jeep's rear bench seat. This exposed the thin steel floor of the vehicle. It wasn't enough. Firing directly on that floor would punch a hole right through it. They needed to spread the force. They needed to connect the mortar's baseplate directly to the strongest part of the Jeep, its steel frame. They would have needed a welder, or at least a drill and some heavy-duty bolts. They probably scrounged for materials. Maybe they found a thick plank of hardwood from a bombed-out Italian farmhouse, or a salvaged steel plate from a destroyed German half-track. The plan was simple and brutal. They would create a new, permanent platform. They laid their salvaged plank or steel plate across the Jeep's rear chassis, bolting it directly to the frame rails. Then, they took the mortar's heavy base plate and welded or bolted it directly onto this new platform. They sacrificed the mortar. It could never be used on the ground again. They had created a hybrid, a monster. They had permanently married the 136-pound weapon to the 2,400-pound vehicle. They looked at their creation. It was ugly. It was wrong. It was a violation of all military logic. It was perfect, but the hack wasn't complete. A mortar fires in a high arc. To hit a target 2,000 meters away, the barrel has to point nearly straight up at an 85-degree angle. But to hit a German bunker on the side of a mountain, you don't need a high arc. You need a flat one. The Brazilians needed their mortars to act like a cannon. They needed to fire at a low angle, maybe 40 or 50 degrees. But the mortar's bipod, the two legs that hold the barrel up, wasn't designed for that. It would collapse. So they improvised again. They threw away the bipod. They didn't need it. Instead, they fabricated a new support. They probably found a heavy wooden beam or a steel pipe. They attached this support near the front of the Jeep, creating a simple, fixed cradle for the barrel to rest in. Now, the Jeep itself was the aiming mechanism. To aim left or right, the driver just had to turn the wheel of the Jeep. To aim up or down, the crew would shove wooden wedges under the cradle. It was crude. It was imprecise. But it was fast. The Mortar Jeep, the Jeep Mortar, was born. Now came the moment of truth. The test. The sergeant, the crew, they probably drove their creation to a secluded valley, far from the prying eyes of their own officers. They parked the Jeep, pointed it at an empty hillside. The crew chief, a man with incredible courage or incredible foolishness, stood by the barrel. He took a single 81mm high-explosive shell. He checked the angle. He looked at his crew, who were probably taking cover 50 meters away. He took a breath, and he dropped the shell down the tube. The explosion was deafening. A concussion of fire and gray smoke erupted from the Jeep. The vehicle, all 2,400 pounds of it, jumped. The tires compressed, the suspension slammed down, and the entire chassis bucked violently, lifting off the ground for a split second. The shell screamed into the sky. It missed the hillside entirely, but that didn't matter. The Jeep was still in one piece. The motor was still attached. The hack worked. They were in business. They had created a weapon the Germans had no answer for. They had created the shoot and scoot tactic decades before it became official doctrine. They had created a weapon that could drive up a trail, stop, fire 3 rounds in 10 seconds, and be gone before the first German countermortar shell even left its tube. The deadly equation was about to be rewritten, and Lodinia was about to be silenced. The opportunity to test the new weapon in combat came quickly. It was likely during the final push, the spring offensive of April 1945. The Brazilians were tasked with taking the heavily fortified town of Montesi, a medieval town perched on a hillside. It was the anchor of the entire German defensive line in that sector. It was protected by minefields, interlocking machine gun nests, and pre-sighted artillery. Taking it by standard infantry assault was not just costly, it was a massacre. The attack began, and just as expected, it faltered. A Brazilian infantry company, perhaps from the 11th Regiment, advanced up a terrace hill. They crossed an open field. And then it happened. The sound, the tearing canvas rip of Lodinia, an MG-42, hidden in the rubble of a stone farmhouse on the ridge, opened up. The range was 800 meters. The Brazilians were caught in the open. They dove for cover, pressing their faces into the Italian dirt. Men were hit. The advance stopped dead. The platoon leader screamed into his radio. He needed that gun silenced. Now, back at the command post, the radio operator would have relayed the message. The conventional mortar crews would have started their slow, agonizing process. Grab the 136-pound base plate. Grab the barrel. Start hauling. 20 minutes. But the Jittenho crew was listening. The sergeant and his team were already in their monster. The engine of the Willys Jeep roared to life. While the infantry platoon was pinned, the Jeep Mortar was moving. It wasn't crawling, it was flying. It bounded up a narrow mule track, its tires churning through the mud. The driver, a man with nerves of steel, navigated the cratered road, swerving around disabled trucks and shell holes. In the back, the gunner and loader clung to the steel frame, their helmets low, their knuckles white. They were a 60 mph target. Every German artillery spotter on every mountain was watching them. It was a race against the German guns and against Lodinia. The Jeep Mortar reached its firing position. It wasn't a fortified bunker. It was just a small bend in the road, a shallow ditch that offered a sliver of cover. The driver slammed on the brakes. The Jeep skidded to a halt in the mud. He didn't turn off the engine. The engine had to stay running. The hack wasn't just about shooting, it was about scooting. The radio man, already on the ground, confirmed the coordinates from the forward observer. The gunner in the back didn't need to assemble anything. The weapon was ready. He grabbed the hand crank. He and the loader put their shoulders into the wooden cradle, adjusting the elevation. The driver shouted, "Left, a little left," and turned the entire Jeep's chassis 2 degrees to the left. The barrel was now pointing directly at the German farmhouse 800 meters away. "Fire!" the sergeant yelled. The gunner dropped the first shell. The explosion was violent. The Jeep bucked, the chassis groaned, but the heavy steel frame held. The high-explosive shell arced across the valley. The forward observer, still pinned with his men, watched it fall. It landed 20 meters long, exploding behind the farmhouse. A good first shot. Drop 20, he screamed over the radio. The gunner in the Jeep didn't need to recalculate. He knew his weapon. He cranked the elevation wheel. Fire. The second shell was dropped. This one was perfect. It landed directly in the courtyard of the farmhouse. The explosion was followed by screams, but Ladinya didn't stop. It was protected by stone walls. The crew inside was shaken, but they were still firing. They knew they were being targeted. Ladinya swiveled. The German gunner stopped firing at the infantry and turned his weapon on the new threat. He had seen the muzzle flash. He saw the Jeep in the ditch. They began fighting 20 rounds per second at the Jeep mortar crew. Bullets sparked off the engine block, tearing through the canvas seats. The Brazilians were now in a duel. A heavy mortar versus a heavy machine gun. Fire, fire, fire. The sergeant roared. The Brazilian loader was a machine. He wasn't waiting for corrections. He was initiating fire for effect. He grabbed a shell, dropped it, grabbed another, dropped it. Grabbed a third, dropped it, thump, thump, thump. 3 81mm high explosive shells were in the air at the same time, flying toward the farmhouse. The Brazilian crew wasn't even watching. They were already diving back into the Jeep. Go, go, get us out. The driver slammed the Jeep into gear. The tires spun, spraying a plume of mud 20 feet high. The vehicle lurched forward, fishtailing wildly as it raced back down the trail. As they rounded the first bend, they heard the sound, a sound like a freight train. The German counter-battery fire, their own mortar. Shells landed exactly where the Jeep had been, not 3 seconds earlier. The earth erupted in fountains of black dirt and steel, but the Jeep was gone. They had fired 5 rounds and displaced in under 60 seconds. Back at the farmhouse, the world had ended. The 3 Brazilian shells landed in a perfect bracket. One hit the roof, collapsing the second floor. The second hit the front wall, blasting the machine gun nest apart. The third landed in the ruble. And then, silence. Ladinya was quiet. The German gun was gone. The crew was gone. In the field below, the Brazilian infantry lifted their heads. The air was quiet. The constant, terrifying rip of the MG-42 had vanished. The platoon leader blew his whistle. Up! Let's go! Vamos. The company rose as one man and charged the hill. They took the position in 10 minutes. The deadly equation had been broken. The Jeep motor crew, now safely back at their rally point, might have allowed themselves a grim smile. The hack worked. Doctrine was for fools. Speed was life. The story did not end with one machine gun nest. That first success was a proof of concept. Word spread, not through official memos or updated field manuals. Word spread the way all truly useful battlefield information does. Soldier to soldier, sergeant to sergeant, in hushed tones, over a cigarette or a shared ration. A crew from another regiment would see the monstrous Jeep mortar rumble past, caked in mud and cordite, and the idea would light a fire. Why aren't we doing that? Soon, other crews began their own field modifications. The hack was replicated. Each crew added their own local flavor, their own Jeep. Some might have reinforced the chassis with more steel. Others might have built a blast shield out of scavenged armor plate to protect the driver. They were creating, in real time, the ancestor of all modern self-propelled artillery. They were mechanics and welders turned into battlefield engineers, operating without blueprints, driven only by the lethal urgency of the front line. This unofficial Jeep mortar squadron became a legend among the They were the FEB's cavalry, the fire brigade. When an attack stalled, when Ladinya opened up, the call would go out, and the infantry would hold on, their eyes scanning the rear not for men on foot, but for the telltale silhouette of a Willys Jeep racing up the trail. The sound of that 4-cylinder engine became a symbol of hope, a promise that revenge was coming, and it was coming fast. But what did the official command structure think of this? What did the American liaisons, attached to the FEB, think? The Brazilians were, after all, an allied force operating under American command structure and using American equipment. We can only imagine the scene. A be-the-book American ordnance captain, sent to inspect the Brazilian motor pool, stumbling upon one of these creations. He would have stared in disbelief. His eyes would trace the crude weld lines connecting a multi-$1,000 mortar base plate to the frame of a government tissue Jeep. He would see the improvised wooden cradle, the missing bipod, the scorched paint on the Jeep's hood. He would have opened his field manual. He would have flipped through every page. He would find regulations for maintaining tire pressure, for cleaning the rifle, for emplacing the M1 mortars on slopes. He would find nothing, absolutely nothing, that authorized turning a Jeep into a piece of mobile artillery. His first reaction would be outrage. This was a flagrant, grotesque violation of doctrine. It was an unauthorized destruction of military property. The weapon's accuracy was gone. The crew was exposed. The vehicle was compromised. By every metric in the book, it was wrong. And then the Brazilian sergeant, the crew chief, would have probably shrugged, offered the captain a cigarette, and said simply, "Mas funciona," but it works. And there, in that moment, is the entire story. The clash of two worlds. The world of doctrine versus the world of results. The American military mind, brilliant at logistics, at standardization, at building a machine that could equip millions. And the Brazilian mind, brilliant at adaptation, at improvisation, at finding the one solution that works right now, even if it's ugly, even if it breaks the rules. The captain would have no answer, because the proof was undeniable. The next day, another German machine gun nest would fall silent. The infantry would advance. The wrong idea was saving lives. This hack could only have come from the Brazilians. An American GI would have been court-martialed for attempting it. A British soldier would have been told to wait for proper equipment. But the FEB was unique. They were a small, tight-knit force, far from home, with a stubborn pride and a cultural imperative to solve the problem. The Gitino was not just a clever trick. It was their most effective psychological weapon. It was their answer to superior German engineering and rigid Allied doctrine. The true impact of the Jeep mortar wasn't just the bunkers it destroyed. It was the psychological terror it inflicted on the German defenders. The Gothic line was built on a single, unchallenged assumption, that the enemy was slow. The Germans knew how long it took to range a mortar. They knew they had a safe window of at least 15 minutes to fire, terrorize, and then reposition before the first shells fell. Their entire defensive strategy relied on this gap in time. The Jeep mortar erased that gap. It turned a 15-minute window into a 30-second gamble. Suddenly, for the German machine gunner, pulling the trigger on his MG42 was no longer a safe bet. It was a death sentence. The moment he fired, he was broadcasting his location. And, unlike before, the reply wasn't a slow, plodding march of men carrying steel. The reply was the scream of a Jeep engine, followed by the immediate, violent thump of an 81mm shell. The Brazilians were no longer playing by the rules. They were hunting. And the German gunners, the kings of the mountain, were now the prey. They had to think twice. And in a firefight, the man who thinks twice dies. This weapon, this Jeep Mortero, became the tip of the Brazilian spear in the final spring offensive. The tactic evolved. It was no longer just a defensive fire brigade. It became a core part of the assault. The crews became masters of shoot and scoot, a doctrine they were literally inventing on the fly. An infantry platoon would advance until it hit a strong point. The Jeep crew, moving right behind them, would pull up, slam the brakes, and obliterate the nest with 5 high-explosive rounds. The infantry would then leapfrog past them, and the Jeep would race forward to the next position. It was fire and movement, mechanized and terrifyingly fast. The German defenders, who had spent months in the security of their concrete bunkers, secure in the knowledge of their tactical superiority, had no answer. The Brazilians weren't following the rules. They were advancing with their artillery, moving as fast as a man could run. The Gothic line, that impossible 200-mile wall, didn't just break, it shattered. The Brazilians, using their unique blend of courage and improvisation, punched a hole clean through. They took Zocca, they pushed the German 148th Division and the Italian Monte Rosa Division into a full, desperate retreat. And then, just as this brilliant, unorthodox tactic was being perfected, it was over. On May 2, 1945, the German forces in Italy signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was finished. The fighting stopped. The silence that fell over the Apennine Mountains was absolute. The Lerdenhass were quiet forever. And in the silent aftermath, the Jeep mortar hack vanished. It was, after all, a wartime expedient. A desperate measure for a desperate time. When the accountants and logisticians returned, when the beaver book captains took over, they didn't see a brilliant innovation. They saw a destroyed Jeep and a ruined mortar. They saw unauthorized field modifications. The Jeeps were almost certainly reclaimed by the American motor pools. their strange steel and wood modifications torn out, the vehicles scrapped or repainted, the evidence erased. There were no medals for this. How do you write a citation for a man who willfully destroyed a 136-pound mortars? How do you reward a sergeant for proving the field manual was wrong? The action was too unconventional, too outside the lines to be officially recognized. The innovation was filed away under lessons learned, if it was filed at all. It survived only as a story, a legend told by the Prasinas who saw it, the men whose lives were saved by it. Decades later, the world's militaries would spend billions of dollars to create exactly what this sergeant had built. They would call them self-propelled mortar systems or mobile fire support vehicles. They would be mounted on specialized chassis, equipped with hydraulic stabilizers and digital fire control computers. But the core idea, the principle, was the same. The principle that firepower must be combined with speed. The principle that a weapon that cannot get to the fight in time is useless. The principle that doctrine is a guide, not a god. A nameless Brazilian sergeant had invented it first, in a muddy field in Italy. Wheat, no budget, no blueprints, and no permission. He did it with scrap wood, a welding torch, and the most powerful force on any battlefild. The Gitanyo, and what of the hero himself, the man who had the idea? He, like the other 25,000 members of the FEB, simply went home. He returned to Brazil. He took off his uniform, paquete to why. He didn't write a book. He didn't lecture at military academies. He went back to his old life. He became a mechanic in a small garage in São Paulo, a farmer in Minas Gerais, an electrician in Rio. He lived a long, quiet, ordinary life. Perhaps, decades later, as an old man, he might have told his grandchildren the story, how he and his crew welded a cannon to a Jeep and hunted Nazis in the mountains of Italy. His grandchildren would have laughed, patting the old man on the back. A war story, a fisherman's tale. But the sergeant would know. He would know that for a few brief, violent weeks in 1945, he and his crew were the most advanced and effective weapon system on the planet. Their monument is not cast in bronze. Their monument is the families of the men who didn't die, the infantry platoons who advanced up those hills and came back down again. The doctrine was broken, but the German line was broken faster.